Welcome to the Woman's Current. Is the tide turning? I'm Sylvia Beckerman.
And I'm Molly Wadzik. Together we're exploring how women support women across generations, experiences, and perspectives.
From baby boomers to millennials and beyond, we're asking, are we lifting each other up? And how do we keep the tide moving forward?
Each week we'll dive into real conversations with women who are reshaping the currents and reflect on what those stories mean for all of us.
So let's dive in. Let's get started.
It's like getting another pair of glasses when you enter the alternative universe. These magic glasses that allow you suddenly to see all the suffering around you in various forms.
Today's conversation is not really about grief in the way we're used to hearing grief discussed. It's not about silver linings or becoming stronger or neatly transforming pain into wisdom. It's about what happens when loss becomes part of the architecture of your life. My guest today is Danielle Crittenden, writer, journalist, and author, whose recent work and new book, Dispatches from Grief, A Mother's Journey Through the Unthinkable, explore not only the death of her daughter, but the accumulation of loss over a lifetime and the emotional terrain women are so often expected to navigate quietly, peacefully, and sometimes publicly. Because women are so often expected to turn suffering into meaning, to explain it, to package it, to emerge from it somehow improved. But what if grief doesn't work that way? What if loss doesn't replace earlier losses, but instead sits beside them? What happens to identity, motherhood, marriage, friendship, and ordinary daily life after something irreversible happens? And how do women continue forward when the world they understood no longer exists in the same way? Molly isn't able to join us for this conversation, but several of the questions she wanted to explore are woven into today's conversation. Danielle, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
One of the things that struck me so strongly in your recent writing was your resistance to the idea that tragedy must somehow produce personal growth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that I think, and thank you for that intro, because I like how you said how grief becomes part of the architecture of your life, and this type of grief really does. And I don't think it's just women who are urged to turn whatever bad happens to them into, personal growth, something we learn from and benefit from. I think that's kind of baked into the American culture, that a business fails and you grow from that, you learn from that, and that can be true. But it also extends over into what I began to call the happiness hucksters, and that even a tragedy of this proportion should enable you to become a better person, to learn from it, to become more empathetic, whatever. And that gets, I've heard from so many fellow grieving parents that people say that to them. They read it. There are grief courses that are going to teach you how to grow from this. And at the bottom presumption of that is that my loss of my daughter is a good thing for me. And I look back and I think, I was a pretty good person before. I didn't need her to die to benefit from, and have more growth. So I think that is a lot of the undercurrent of what someone who is experiencing this kind of tragedy is being told by people and organizations and grief books around them.
You mean the 5 stages of grief?
The 5 stages of grief I wouldn't put it quite in that category, but I would say, maybe it works, maybe it is true in some cases of grief. But when you lose a child, and I just want to say my daughter Miranda was 32 when she died suddenly, consequences of a previous brain operation. Um, when, you're looking for order, you're looking for meaning, the pain is so overwhelming. It's so incapacitating, and not just mental anguish,
Mm.
but physically as well. It's like your heart has been ripped out, open heart surgery style, and you're holding it in your hand and you're just bleeding. And the immediate impulse, in fact, and that's one of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross book is, the 5 stages of grief. And you turn to that. That was one of the first books I turned to because I thought, like, I don't know how I'm gonna survive this. When will this pain stop? What is happening to me? And the 5 stages is like, well, it's all very tidy. There will be these phases, and then you'll come to acceptance and you'll be fine. And it's just not true. Like, this kind of grief is not tidy, it's not orderly, it has changed your life irrevocably, and it has changed you irrevocably, and the way you're going to get on, not even through it or past it, or to some acceptance, maybe resignation, is by learning to carry that grief, and that's what I think people don't understand who haven't suffered this kind of tragedy, just how transformative it is of everything in the person's life.
And the thing is that your writing pushes back against the societal acceptance and what is perceived as to how a person is supposed to accept, grow, whatever adjective, verb, whatever you want to put through it. As I said to you, my brother, it'll be 20 years in September. He suffered from depression and died by suicide. It's nothing that my family will not talk about. And it affected my mother in ways that are unimaginable. Um, but of course, everyone, you're supposed to move on, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to. Um, do you feel people were somehow more comfortable if your grief could be framed as growth?
I think what again, and we're talking about I described that when a tragedy of this kind, it doesn't have to be specifically the loss of a child, although I think that's really, at the top of the pyramid of tragedy, um, that people who haven't experienced it I said it was like being deported to an alternative universe. Nothing you ever knew is the same again, even everything that is familiar. You wake up in the same house, you wake up in the same bed, but everything has changed. And I think somebody who hasn't entered this alternative universe uh, doesn't understand that you are now, it's not the same, you're not speaking the same language anymore. And by the way, I have a lot of empathy for this, for people who are not here, and a lot of envy in many ways, but a lot of empathy for people who don't understand, because how could they understand? And I think they, and especially if they've never really suffered any kind of grief, they do have this notion that after a certain amount of time, you'll feel better. And look, I had it too. I had friends who they weren't especially close friends, but I have friends who lost a son at about the same age as your brother. And I was, very empathetic. And then a year passes and you kind of cease to ask about it. You just assume that that person is coping or coping in their own way. And and so it's a kind of like I get it. But for the person who has lost a child, you're not moving on at the same pace. You may never move on. Um, and there is always a little bit of surprise a year, 2 years later. I'd be very curious to hear about your mother and how she coped, that you've somehow come to terms with it. And from what I gather from Miranda died 2 years ago, from what I gather from mothers and fathers further along this path than I do, 10 years, 20 years, um, they've learned to cope. They've learned to carry the grief. But they are not the same, and they are still very, very, very sad, that life, has just changed irrevocably.
There's coping and carrying, and not everyone is able to.
Mhm.
And it looks different for everyone. Um, my mother had a very hard time with it, and I don't think she ever was able to. I'm going to use integrated into her life
Mhm.
to accept it, to move not move past, but to really be able to put it someplace that did not affect her on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And so everyone has their own way of living after a tragedy, especially the loss of a child, because it's not supposed to go in that order.
Right, and I wanna return a little bit to the physicality of it because that's, I think, what people really don't understand. They get that you're sad, and they, of course, wanna comfort you. And by the way, the physicality isn't even understood by the grieving themselves.
No.
I got very interested in it, that your mortality rate, if you've lost a child, and especially if you're a mother who has lost a child, you're more likely to die within 5 years of your child's death, that it just shoots up, and part of that is because, um, you just lose the desire to live, you stop taking care of yourself, you fall to whatever health effects that brings on. Some commit suicide, and some become addicted, they become alcoholics or addicted to something else, and I totally get that. Like, I completely understand that, in ways that I wouldn't have appreciated before. And this is, look, I have 2 living children, and we were all very, very close. And yet I can still understand the desire not to want to keep going and the effort it takes to keep going, if not for yourself, but for the rest of your family.
Exactly. And you asked me a question about my mom. We were 5. Now you can say we're 4, and that I want to get into in a little bit about that. And there were 5 grandchildren. It affected her physically, it affected her emotionally, and it affected her health.
Mhm.
That was something that she carried with her until she passed away. 6 from 13, that she died. She passed in 2013. My brother in 2006.
Mhm.
So, as I said, it affects everyone differently, and that's what people don't understand.
Mhm.
There's no magical number for grief.
Mhm.
And I want to ask you, do you think women are particularly pressured to make suffering meaningful for other people?
No, what I do write about is, I think women, and especially mothers, are often criticized or feel belittled because of their willingness to put others before their own needs. And I think, honestly, that is a maternal superpower. The ability to fasten your child's seatbelt
Right.
first before you fasten yours is an unbelievable strength. Um, and when your child dies, one of the things that happened to me was I completely lost that ability, and I just withdrew. I was incapable of doing anything, like, literally anything, and most of all, I couldn't comfort my children.
Sure.
Um, and in some ways, we had to turn tables and they were comforting me, which just made me feel so wretchedly guilty and powerless. Gradually, I was able to come back, but for that period, I think it was terribly hard on them. And I felt like I had lost, to not be able to comfort your children is just one of the biggest things that you do when you as a mother and when you love them. Um, so that I found that very distressing. I haven't felt anybody, except as I said, the happiness hucksters, the people out there to grow from this suffering. I mean, personally or, in general in my life.
I want to talk about accumulation of loss because I know that you lost sister. You've had many losses in family before this. You wrote something that really stayed with me, that your daughter's death didn't replace earlier losses, it joined them, that grief accumulates. And I thought that was such a profound way of describing loss because I think people often imagine grief as singular when in reality it becomes layered. Uh,
Mhm.
you wrote that your daughter's death stands taller than others, but is propped up by the losses that came before her death.
Yes, I wrote in the beginning, the first chapter is about different types of grief. And I think the first line of the book is, I thought I knew grief. David and I haven't lost a sister, but
I'm
David and
sorry.
I have both lost parents. And in one case, David's mother, she died at 54 after many years of um, sort of fighting and living with leukemia. So when she died, she was young and it was sudden in that we didn't expect it was going to happen at that moment, but it was also kind of expected. And as we talked about earlier, the order of things that a child at some level always assumes that their parents are going to die at some point. And it's built into the system.
Yes.
And when it happens, even if you're terribly close to them, or it happens, unless it happens, very tragically and suddenly and early, um, you're kind of wired to cope with it in a way that you simply aren't wired to cope with the reverse order. But so I I have experienced loss before this, and it it helped me, but it didn't help me, because this was such a shock of, such a magnitude greater.
One of the things that Molly wanted to ask was the emotional exhaustion that can come from carrying these losses all at once.
Yeah. I mean, again, the physicality of it. So, um, you're not just, I talked about the sort of long term mortality, but in the immediate, I've now come to appreciate the nervous system as a separate organ because you're not really aware of it, but in fact, and especially in tragedy and trauma, it it starts to function in ways that you're not even conscious of. So when you talk about that exhaustion, you just I mean, you just I was so deeply exhausted. I have to say at the end of day, talking about the book, I just collapse at the end of the day. It kind of brings this all
Sure.
back. But there's exhaustion. You get a kind of brain fog. You make poor decisions. And as I said, I just lost interest in everything. I stopped writing, and then I stopped doing the things I used to enjoy, like playing the piano or gardening, just anything I lost interest in. And meanwhile, the brain itself is in a trauma state. And I talk about finally coming upon EMDR therapy, which is for PTSD, which is in fact what you have.
It is.
And that helps the brain process trauma because otherwise, as I've learned, the brain doesn't know what to do with trauma. So it doesn't file it the way it does with other memories. It kind of stays omnipresent in the brain. And that's why people, I use this expression, being mugged by grief. Like even on good days, you can be going along and seeming okay. And then suddenly you're just, you know, it's caught you around the throat. You're suddenly crying. Um, and part of EMDR therapy is to help you process it and cope. So as my therapist said, that you're not going to get over your grief, you're not going to be less sad, but we're going to help you so that the grief doesn't control you. And I've found that that is true and been very helpful. I have a much better control over it, but that doesn't mean, I can get through a day without breaking down or being overcome physically and mentally.
And what people don't understand is PTSD is not just for people coming back from war, it's trauma. It's
Yeah,
it's
it is.
trauma, and there are many, many different types of trauma, this being one of them.
Yes, for
You
sure. Well, they in fact now the EMDR therapy, which involves originally and it was just speculative by this one therapist that she thought that the brain didn't process trauma the way it did other things, and it began by watching a dot go back and forth as you recounted the trauma. Now I talk to a therapist online, and she has buzzers in my hands that alternate left and right. And she speculated that by talking through any particular trauma, it's like, apparently the only way you can get a song out of your head is to play it all the way through, and this is the way the brain learns to process left and right hippocampus to kind of get that whatever aspect of the trauma processed. And now in just the past few years, they've confirmed that this is true. They've watched on MRIs the brains of people who have suffered trauma that, when they're asked to remember something, ordinary, it's all fine. But then when they ask to remember their trauma, the brain starts lighting up in different areas that aren't even associated with memory. So we're learning a lot more about what trauma does to you. And certainly this has helped me cope a lot better day to day.
That brings me to, has grief changed your relationship to ordinary life, social interaction, conversation, even simple questions that people ask casually?
Yeah, I mean, the most common questions, especially between mothers, suddenly become the most fraught. So, you'll meet somebody new and you'll be chatting the way you always chatted, and they'll say or she'll say, how many children do you have?" And suddenly, you're, "Oh my gosh, what do I say?" And s I will often, because it's odd, but now the grieving person is in the position of, "Do I drop this nuclear bomb on this otherwise well-meaning person or not?" And I'll often try go several rounds before I will wanna say that I've lost a child. I'll say 3, "How many do you have?" I'll keep trying to put it back to the person. But yeah, it initially, and again, as part of the early grief, you know, I I I didn't wanna go out, I couldn't be with people. You just can't re-enter the atmosphere that quickly, and when you do, it remains it remains fraught, just not just for those kinds of ordinary questions, but you also become quite self-conscious that, you don't also want to appear like, as I call it, a grief bore. Like, you don't wanna be the bad fairy at every gathering, and, so you learn to kind of pretend or put on a good face just so you can make others around you comfortable. You don't always wanna be the person walking in the door saying, "Oh, there's Danielle. She lost her eldest." That so that you have to do this little dance of adaptation, um, not least to it sounds funny, but to comfort the other people so that you can at least try and resume some sort of, uh, normalcy in, your social life and with your friends.
Well, I kind of get that when people say, "How many siblings do you have?"
Mhm.
Um, and there are times where I will say, "There were 5, now there's 4,
Yep.
plus 2, and, um, brother-in-laws." But at what point do in your head, you're going because someone's gonna say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss."
Yeah.
And then where do you go with that? "Oh,
Right.
no, it's okay. I've exceeded,"
No,
but,
you start comforting them. It's like, "Oh, no,
it's
no, it's okay.
oh,
I'm okay, really, really." It you start to apologize. But, what can you do? It's a hard fact to land on someone.
and here's a question for you. Do you think people underestimate how much emotional calculation grief requires every single day?
No, and again, I don't blame anyone for that. I understand it. I used to in the life of the before, I was that way too, but, um, that's part of the change of the person that you are trying to both, as I said, learn how to reenter the atmosphere, but you're reentering it as a different person. And, uh, and they they just can't know and they can't see it. And again, it's not their fault. I mean, people, when you see a friend or a relative who is suffering, as one suffers in this situation, your impulse is to comfort them. You want to go to them and say, "Look, it's going to be okay. You're going to be okay. You're so strong." And that is the last thing anyone in this situation wants to hear, because it's almost and again, I've done it myself. It's it's a good impulse, but it's not the right impulse because what the grieving person wants is the tragedy and the proportions of the tragedy to be recognized. And in a way, the best thing you can say is, "Oh, Danielle, this is so terrible. I am so sorry. What," and not even "What can I do?" Because that's another thing
Yeah.
that is like an imposition upon the grieving person. Like, I don't know, go get me some chicken soup. Like, you're not gonna you're not gonna reply to that. But to say, "Danielle, I'm so sorry. Do you wanna go for a dog walk? Do you wanna grab a coffee? Can I get you another scotch?" You know,
There
like,
you go.
that's what you want, and actually, I'm very blessed to have some good friends, and they were not in the universe with me. Some were, but others weren't, and they just they just showed up. That's all they did. They didn't expect me to be jolly. They didn't say these little bromides to me. They just were there, and I think another aspect of grief that I've discovered, especially since writing this book and hearing back from so many, of my fellow immigrants or deportees to the universe, is how lonely it is. Like, a lot of people are struggling alone. They don't have friends who understands. Imagine being a single mother, or father where you don't have even the other parent. If you wanna talk about marriage, because that's another minefield in when you lose a child, but are just struggling alone, and as you said earlier, in a world that is just expecting them to move on, and in some cases, move on very quickly, and it's just so hard.
One of the things that I do want to talk about is motherhood and identity. And what keeps coming back to in your writing is this idea that motherhood doesn't disappear after loss. The
Mm,
relationship continues, the identity continues. It changes shape. And I
mhm.
wonder if part of the difficulty is that society often doesn't quite know where to place mothers whose children have gone. Has motherhood changed shape for you?
Yes, actually, my therapist at one point said early on, Danielle, you're going to have the relationship you had with Miranda is gone, and you're going to have to form a new relationship with her. And I thought that was very profound. And your love, and this is the thing about maternal love, it never goes away. It never ceases. My my love for my daughter is as strong as it ever was, as fierce as it ever was. And part of keeping her alive is talking about her, but also so long as I feel I'm doing things for her, I feel like I'm still her mother. And so after she died, I spent a lot of time designing, as I said, I like gardening, designing a wildflower garden where she is buried. And that was weirdly therapeutic and nice because even though it was for a very grim, potentially grim task, it actually, I kept feeling I was nurturing something with Miranda. And it's when you stop having those things to do. So, in some ways, writing this book or talking about this book, as hard as it often is, I feel I'm extending her reach, and she is continuing to remain alive in some way.
What has happened to your sense of identity through all this, not only as a mother, but as a woman, a partner, a writer, a person moving through the world?
Um, I when I wrote that section on the happiness hucksters and how we're supposed to grow, I mean, you change, and the way I look at it is not so much, you know, your daughter's death has been a gift to your growth. You take the gifts from your daughter's life and you embody them. And so Miranda, and by the way, I don't deify her in this book. She caused my hair to stand on end many, many times. But um, because you want to remember somebody in full, but when you also want to embody their best characteristics, and she was a very, very empathetic. She had a natural way of whomever she met, and she made friends everywhere she went. Like, basically, if you met Miranda, you were her friend. But she had a great ability to sense right away that if you were someone who had suffered trauma, whatever sorrow or insecurity or burden you were carrying with you, she could see that. And so I think often now I am much more open than I was to just it's like getting another pair of glasses when you enter the alternative universe, these magic glasses that allow you suddenly to see all the suffering around you in various forms, and so I'm now extremely sensitive to that. Much not to say that I wasn't empathetic or sensitive before, but it's just on another level, and when I reach out and help, I feel I'm channeling some of Miranda's energy.
You mentioned something about marriage and partnership. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, it you can see why marriages fall apart so readily because just as I was saying earlier, the impulse of the mother to withdraw from her own living children, there's also the impulse to withdraw from the marriage. And I think, you know, if I can make this generalization, that men and women, fathers and mothers, experience grief differently. I mean, everybody experiences grief in their own way, but I think you can make generalities about it, the way that I've found that, and the parents I've spoken to and in my own marriage, that the fathers have a greater capacity to lose themselves in work. Like they can more compartmentalize, which isn't to say they're suffering less, but it's
No.
just they're able to sort of box it, and then in my husband's case, it would pop out at 3 in the morning, and I'd wake up and find him awake and just, so upset. Whereas, it just overtook my entire being, and, I'm lucky that I have a long marriage, a strong marriage, and a supportive marriage, and at one point early on, David came to me, my husband David, and he said, "Look, we can't let ourselves go into our own silos of grief. We have to get through this together." And that really kind of shook me in a good way, and I became much more self-conscious or conscious of withdrawing and making sure that even though my default setting was to crawl under the bed and howl, that even when howling, I was reaching out to him, and vice versa. When I would see him vanishing into his head and not really wanting to talk about it out of fear that not least out of fear he might upset me more, when I got him to talk about it, I think it helped him. That being said, I know of marriages where, like, especially the mother just completely withdraws. Even in one case, 10 years later, she was still just a kind of zombie, like, not connecting to anyone in her family. I get that. I can see if there was ever if you thought that, even if not true, that the other parent was in some way culpable, like, "Why did you take your eyes off the pool for 2 minutes?" That kind of thing?
Mm.
Um, that I don't know how a marriage can recover from that. The grief is so intensely deep and personal and crippling that it does. It's like you need, like, I don't know, marital physiotherapy to come through this and keep working the huge effort it takes every day to tend to that relationship as much, as you can. And it's not easy.
Not easy. I, I saw how my parents, I don't want to use the word dealt, but I can't think of another how it affected them, and they had a very long, strong marriage. How each one of them coped or put the loss of my brother differently, but together.
Did your mother withdraw? Did she, um I mean, you said she died, what, 8 years after or so, or 7 years
Yes,
after your son?
yes.
Do you think that was a consequence, or in part because of the loss of her son?
I think that her health declined because of it more rapidly than it would have. So it affects people in so many different ways. And as you said, you're always questioning, "Oh, what could I have done? What did I do?"
Yep.
And although my father was retired, my father, whether he hid it or not, it was different than how my mother coped on a day-to-day basis, but they did have each other.
Yeah.
And then, there were all of us. It's an experience that in my lifetime, I hope I never, ever will knock on something. I know my aunt went to 3 years ago. Her daughter had been in a horrific car accident the
Ugh.
same weekend that Christopher Reeves had been in,
Oh,
but
wow.
she was in a better, if you wanna say better condition. She worked, she drove, and then 20 some odd years later, all of a sudden, and we do a family Zoom, have since the pandemic.
Yeah.
Since that March of, and she was on the day before, and then they got a call that she'd had a stroke. She's still there, it's taken her 3 or 4 years to go through some cartons of hers. But people don't understand, everyone has their own way of putting this in their life.
I only recently, with the help of my younger daughter and a friend and my daughter-in-law, were we able to go through Miranda's clothes. I had to close up her apartment. Just in addition to the grief, the tasks that you have to do, um, are so really just horrific. It's leveling, to do these things, and so it does take time. The other thing I, um, talk about is in this digital age, you're also I call these emotional IEDs, like, there you'll be, looking at your phone and then suddenly Facebook has really conveniently curated some happy memories,
Oh, yes.
Here you were in 2018 and you scream like, "Ah!" 'Cause my car keeps asking to connect to Miranda's iPhone, and all of these reminders that even if you can control boxes of clothing and dealing with those, but you can't control the digital imprint that they left that continues on, after life.
One of the things Molly was especially interested in was support and what actually helps when someone experiences devastating loss. Because I think, people become, we sort of talked about this, they're terrified of saying the wrong thing. And
Right.
sometimes that fear creates distance.
Yes.
Other times people rely on language that sounds comforting but feels strongly impersonal. What surprised you most about the way people responded?
I did a kind of taxonomy of responses that I received, some of the most empathetic kind and others, you know, people saying the most crazy things, and it's true, some of your friends, even very close friends, just kind of vanished, because I think they couldn't cope or know how to deal with that level of trauma, in someone else's life. So, and I think that's quite common, among people to whom this has happened. As I mentioned earlier, I think just showing up was really what carried me through. My friends, you know, taking me out, pouring me wine, just hanging out with
Not
me.
scotch?
Scotch too, it depended, but with no expectations that I was going to be, entertaining or my old self. I think, as I mentioned, the therapy really helped me. I think connecting to other mothers has really helped me because, misery really does love company and being able to talk very candidly and frankly about what you're going through with someone else in the situation is helpful. I've become quite a nutty dog lady. I have I had and still have a little Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, and I'm not joking, that dog, but she was just next to me. You wouldn't have been able to see her, but she just jumped down. But, I found a lot of comfort just in having a dog, that you can whose fur you can cry into. So there have been different ways of coping, but just having people there, relating to people who have been through your experience, having therapy, and really just trying to, as I understand it, the sort of way to get through it or carry it is just learning to be present in the moment. It sounds cliche, but
Oh,
actually it's really hard to do. And learning, getting more moments where you're present stretched together where you can enjoy something and that's been happening. It's like the grief, it becomes like this kind of old war wound that you can laugh, you can forget things, you can do something fun and then really enjoy it. And then, oh, there goes my leg. It's flaring up again. And so it's always going to flare up and be there, but it's something that you are able to manage while also, appreciating what is going on around you. And eventually, as one other mother counseled me to appreciate the gift of your own life that, um, we talked about mothers who just lost all sense of purpose and willingness to live and appreciating what you have and what you have left and you really want to regain that sense of appreciation of life. So that's kind of the goal and also what helps.
Um, Endurance and continuing forward, some words I can't get out. I also I think there's a difference between healing and endurance, and
Yeah.
women are often expected to present resilience publicly long before they've privately made sense of what happened.
Yeah.
Do you think women are expected to recover emotionally faster than is realistic? And has your understanding of strength changed?
Um, well, first, I think, and especially from your description of your father, my description of my husband, I think men are, have greater societal expectations upon them to not show their pain, not discuss it. Uh, uh, I haven't felt emotionally pressured to get over it, but in terms of strength, uh, yes, y- you know, I was always thought of myself as a strong person, but having now to carry this and be strong, I think is, having to make decisions that you never expected to make and just surviving them. Like 3 days after my daughter and I had exchanged selfies about what we were going to wear on Valentine's Day, I was sitting in front of a computer monitor with a funeral director choosing a coffin for her. Like going through this level of experience, um, as you say, there's nothing to endure, but to endure, you just have to endure. And um, so that's what you learn to do if you can. And so I guess in that sense, I've had to be not just stronger for myself, but stronger for everybody around me.
Molly had one question she especially wanted to ask you. Who were you before this happened, and who are you now?
Well, my friends used to nickname me the Minister of Fun. Um, so I was always the person getting everyone together, coming up with ideas of what we should do. And um, my daughter Miranda was very similar. She was just like just the life of the party. Whenever we planned trips or whatever, she was like she had figured it all out, where we needed to go, what we needed to see and do. And I was like that as well. And when this happened to me, you would never know that that had been my personality beforehand. And now, I did have to resign my title as, Minister of Fun. But what I've found people saying to me is, like very recently, one of my close friends says, you're looking lighter. You're looking lighter. And I was glad to hear that I'm struggling to come back to some sort of maybe sub-minister, deputy minister of fun, because you want to be able to enjoy life, and you don't, you people will say, "Well, Miranda wouldn't have wanted you to be miserable." Well, okay, I get that, but I am miserable. But I also when I talk about embodying some of her best traits, that too is one of them, is emerging and celebrating and taking joy and seeking joy when one can.
What do you understand now about grief that you didn't before?
Just the enormity of it, the capital G grief that I hadn't experienced, the whole other world it puts you into, and the perspective it gives you. It's that's why I started. I mean, I didn't set out to write a book about it. I just found the old reporter in me just started taking notes because I felt like I was suddenly a foreign correspondent from this other land, and I just started taking notes about what I was experiencing and setting them down, gradually the notes built up, and that's why the title Dispatches from Grief, is really what it's like. I was, like, filing dispatches as I went on, and then eventually I thought, "Well, maybe this would be an essay or whatever," but it gradually formed itself into this book.
What conversations about loss are we still afraid to have, honestly?
I think we're afraid to talk about I mean, one of the things you hear often from others, and again, if don't say this when if you're confronted with this, but I know it's well-meaning. I can't even imagine. And you can't, obviously, and you don't want to, and lucky you. But it's also the brain won't let you. And I think some of the reactions that we got were from people who almost felt like you were contagious, that if you were to talk about it, they might catch it from you. You know, something bad might happen to them. Like, wow, if this happened to Danielle, you feel, I think, invulnerable until it happens. And so I think those are conversations, and that's why I've written so frankly and I want to talk so frankly about it, because I feel it's important that people see what goes on to someone in this world. And I think people are just very afraid to discuss it, not least because they're afraid for themselves.
I was going to kind of say something that I won't. Yeah, the contagion factor.
Mhm.
Um, Last question. What would you want women carrying invisible grief to know?
That when you're in this universe, one of the things, and I'm sure they have discovered, there are so many other people there with you, walking with you. And I think it's important to seek out their company because um, that is ultimately what keeps us going. You become honestly very humble. You understand, yes, it can happen to me. It's it's something that you want to experience or be with other people in this experience, as I said earlier, and also that it is important, as I said, as Miranda would say, like keep seeking joy even when it's impossible. Try and discover, even though it feels impossible, that gift that life has given you, because in the end, that's all we have, but we do still have our love. And one of the things I found scientifically about motherhood is I wrote about this that when a woman gives birth, some of the baby's cells stay in your body for life. And these cells have been known to actually fight illnesses in mothers, like rally like little troops to their rescue in certain situations. And so I just thought that was so beautiful that we still carry this. I still carry Miranda's cells in my body. And in that sense, she still physically lives through me and in me. And I found that just also such a source of comfort. They don't leave you, not if you don't let them.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for this conversation, Danielle. Quick question. Where can people find out more about you?
So you can, the book is available, Dispatches from Grief: A Mother's Journey Through the Unthinkable, uh, on any, book platform and ideally in your local bookstores. You can also find me at daniellecrittenden.com, and that's tricky name, Crittenden. If you Google it or Google the book, you'll find it. And I have a website and you can message me directly. And, I'm taking I'm gonna get to every single message I get from a grieving parent. It may take me some time, but I will. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Again, thank you so much. Um, this has been this has been I can't say the word one. It's been enlightening. It's been wonderful. It's been candid, and I thank you for sharing this with us today.
Well, thank you for letting me share as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Molly, even though you weren't able to join me with Danielle Crittenden, you did give me some of your thoughts, some of your insight questions that you wanted me to ask. And after listening to it, what really stuck out to you? I know for me, one thing that stayed for me from my conversation with Danielle was something that she said near the very end. She was talking about motherhood and the science that some of the children's cells remain in our bodies for life. And then she said, they don't leave you, not if you don't let them. And, I have to stop thinking about that. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that, it's a really powerful image, this idea that the pieces of people that we loved are still a part of us. And I haven't lost a child. I have no idea what that kind of grief is like, but grief is a shared human experience, right? I've lost both of my parents. It'll be 20 years and 10-year anniversaries this year. She wasn't saying life stops, the joy doesn't disappear, but it's saying that something fundamentally changes about you, right? I think that's what grief does. It's transformation. It changes you.
Exactly. And, Danielle challenged the idea that grief is something we get over. And I hate when people say that. She talked instead about learning to carry it, not moving beyond it, not fixing it, but actually carrying it.
Yeah, I think it becomes definitely a piece of something you carry. I felt that. I don't think that there's any way for it not to color the rest of your interactions with other people in this life, right? When I see someone that's lost someone or someone brings it up and they know that I've experienced that deep grief of loss too, there is some sort of beautiful human connection that allows us to see past that veneer, You can see it in
Yeah.
someone's eyes when they've experienced deep grief. And I have over the years learned to view it as I don't know, I want to say a deeper way of that might be cheesy, not a deeper way of connecting with people, but just a different plane. I kind of view it as this glow or orb around you that walks with you. And I think other people who have faced this kind of grief and live with it every day, because that's what it is, right? It's not facing the grief, it's living with it, learning how to make it your friend in some way and your companion.
Yeah, Danielle described it as entering another universe. And I thought that was such a powerful image because she wasn't saying life stops. She wasn't saying joy disappears. And she was saying, you've changed. And I know, as you mentioned, your parents. It'll be 20 years since my brother suddenly passed away, and he passed away from depression. And my mom passed away in 2013, and my dad, it'll be 10 years. And, you change. I cannot imagine losing a child. I know many people who have, unfortunately. And I just love how she talks about it.
Yeah, what she wanted most wasn't the fixing, right? I think it's human nature for people. Sadness and grief and these kind of a spectrum of human emotions make a lot of us uncomfortable, right? Especially those who haven't gotten to the part of life. And I often say sometimes it's a privilege to get to that part of life at some point because it means that you have experienced I don't know, like lived through the human experience enough to really understand that love doesn't disappear like she was talking about. It doesn't go away just because that person isn't physically here anymore. I really like what she said. I think that she just wants acknowledgement that this person existed, that this person is a piece of her, and then it's not something that anyone can fix, right?
Exactly. The other thing that she said that really stayed with me is that people often want to make the grieving person feel better. But she wanted, most wasn't fixing. It was acknowledgement. Someone saying, this is terrible. I'm so sorry. And then simply being there.
Yeah. Having people present around you when you're navigating those early stages of grief and they get to walk alongside you through it, and it's a transformation.
Molly, I'm so glad we could catch up. And this was one episode that really stuck with me.
Yeah, me too. As much as it's emotionally draining to talk about these kind of topics, I feel very grateful and honored to share that kind of space, especially with women who are I always want to say navigating, but it's not really navigating, right? It's learning to live in a different version of how your life has evolved. And I just feel really privileged to get to share those kind of experiences and conversations with women who have gone through it too and live with it.
Well, Molly, until next time. That's it for this episode of The Women's Current. Is the Tide Turning?
If this conversation sparks something in you, we want to hear from you. What's this week's current moment? Tell us on Instagram at The Women's Current. Share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube.
Join us as we explore how women are supporting each other and where do we go from here.
Until next time, I'm Molly Wadzik.
And I'm Sylvia Beckerman. Thanks for listening. This has been a Life of Prey production.